Chapter 5. Crowley and Holt left the castle the following morning. Holt made no mention of his late-night meeting with Morgrath, and they rode in silence for several minutes. Finally, inevitably, it was Crowley who spoke first. "I wonder what he'll do to them." Holt glanced sidelong at him. "Who'll do to who?" he said, ignoring strict grammar. Holt was never a stickler for rules of any kind. "Morgrath! I wonder how he'll punish those 3 men-at-arms we brought in." Holt's lip curled in disdain. "I doubt he'll do anything to them. I suspect they were throwing their weight around with his full approval." Crowley frowned at the statement. Why would he encourage them to do that? "He's a tyrant. Tyrants like their subjects to live in fear. Helps keep them in line." Crowley nodded sadly. "I suppose you're right." He sighed deeply, and Holt looked at him again. "What's the trouble? You're normally such a cheery fellow." Crowley allowed himself a faint grin at that description, coming as it did from the grim, unsmiling figure riding beside him. "I was just thinking what a terrible state the kingdom is in," he said. "Men like Morgrath treating their own subjects so badly, the Royal Council doing their best to undermine the king, and the Ranger Corps nothing more than a group of vain, indolent loafers. I wonder where it will all end." "You're a ranger, and you're not vain," Holt pointed out. "You may be indolent, of course. I can't be sure about that. And you said there were others like you." He was obviously trying to cajole Crowley out of his gloomy mood. But the ranger shook his head and made a hopeless little gesture. "Only a few," he said. "A dozen at most, and we're widely scattered. The Corps Commandant sees to that. They'll get rid of us one by one, with trumped-up charges and accusations, just as they did with Pritchard and the others." "Why not get in first?" Holt said. "Get the others together and fight back. From what you say about the current commanders, they wouldn't put up much of a fight." "I think that's what Morgrath is hoping we'll do," Crowley said. "He'd like to see the last traces of the old Ranger Corps totally destroyed. If we rebelled against our own leadership, technically we'd be rebelling against the king." "It's a problem," Holt said thoughtfully. "Band together and they accuse you of treason. Stay separate and they can pick you off one at a time." "Well, it's not your problem anyway. Have you any idea what you might do?" Holt shrugged. "As I told you, I had a vague idea of joining the Rangers, but that doesn't seem like an option now. I suppose I'll head south and east and cross over to Gallica." "Well, we can ride together for a while longer. The highway south is further along this way. I'll be glad of some cheerful company." "First time anyone said that about me," Holt replied. They came to the fork in the road some 40 minutes later. The south highway branched off to the left, heading across rolling countryside and farmland. The north road, the road Crowley would follow, entered a large forest half a kilometre away. The two men shook hands. "Thanks for your help," Crowley said. "And my cheerful company," Holt added, straight-faced. Crowley smiled. "Yes, that too. I hope things work out for you." "Same to you," Holt said, and the ranger shrugged with mock cheerfulness. "Oh, I'll be fine, I'm sure." There was an awkward pause. The two men had enjoyed each other's company, and each sensed the other was a kindred spirit. But they didn't have a long history of friendship to smooth out the parting. Eventually, Holt broke the silence and turned his horse south. "Well, I suppose I'll be seeing you," he said, and Crowley nodded, raising one hand in salute. "Be seeing you." They rode away from each other, and Holt considered how ridiculous their final words had been. "We won't be seeing each other," he thought. "Why do we say we will?" His path led down a long incline, then up a slope on the other side. He reached the crest and stopped to turn in his saddle, looking after Crowley. But the ranger had already disappeared into the thick forest that straddled the road. Holt pursed his lips. He had a vague feeling that he should have offered to help the ranger. He had a sense that he was letting Crowley down. He wasn't sure what else he could have done, but the uneasy feeling remained. He was about to urge his horse on again when he remembered his fletching jig. He had lent it to Crowley on the first night they were camped, and he realized now that the ranger hadn't returned it. He could manage without it, but the process of fletching an arrow was much more time-consuming without it. He clicked his tongue and turned his horse, setting him to a canter, retracing his path and heading after Crowley. The grey had an easy, long-striding gait, and they covered the distance to the forest in short time. They rode into the dim coolness under the trees. Over the years, branches had grown across the path from each side, so that the road resembled a green-shaded tunnel. The road turned sharply to the right a few hundred meters ahead. There was no sign of Crowley. He must have covered more ground than Holt had expected. He tapped the horse with his heels, urging more speed from him. The hoofbeats were cushioned by the soft surface of the road under the trees. Shaded constantly by the overhanging foliage, the road had never dried out and hardened. In addition, a thick carpet of leaves had built up over the passage of the years. As they neared the turn in the road, Holt became aware of a faint sound. The sliding, scraping clash of steel on steel. He felt a tightening of apprehension in his stomach. He slipped the bow from his shoulder and flicked back a corner of his cloak to leave his quiver unencumbered. The horse's rear hooves skidded slightly on the damp ground as they made the right-hand turn around the bend in the road. 60 meters away, Crowley was backed against a large oak tree, surrounded by a group of armed men. As he took in the scene, Holt counted 4 attackers, with a 5th a few meters away, out of the fight, on his knees and crumpled over, holding his side. Crowley's horse was limping awkwardly on the far side of the road. Without conscious thought, Holt's hand flew to his quiver and sent 2 arrows on their way in the space of a heartbeat. The first inkling that Crowley's attackers had of his presence was when 2 of their number cried out in pain as the black shafted arrows drove into them, slicing through their chainmail as if it were no more than linen. After the first cry, one fell and lay silent. The other continued to moan in pain, crawling on hands and knees away from the scene of the combat. The others turned to see what had happened to their comrades. It was a fatal mistake. Crowley lunged at one, and the sax knife bit deep into the man's body. The other was sent flying as Holt's horse slammed its shoulder into him. The man thudded to the ground, skidding on the damp leaves, then lay still. Holt reined in and swung down from the saddle, dropping the bow and drawing his sax. There was a smear of blood on Crowley's forehead. "Are you all right?" Holt asked. The ranger nodded breathlessly. "Thanks to you, yes," he said. He glanced down at the man he had just run through. He was sprawled on his back, eyes open, staring sightlessly at the sky. "Recognize him?" Holt looked down. He saw the familiar lightning bolt symbol on the man's surcoat, then looked more closely at his face. It was the stoutly built man he had shot through the leg at the tavern. He looked quickly at the others. The man doubled over on his knees, crying in pain, had also been in the tavern, as had the first of the attackers Holt had shot. "Morgarath has a strange idea of punishment," he said. Crowley gave him a tired smile. "Oh, I don't know. It certainly didn't do them any good in the long run. What should we do with them, do you think?" He gestured at the 3 surviving wounded men. "Leave them," Holt said briefly. "No use taking them back to Morgarath. He obviously sent them after you. 5 of them," he added. He thought they'd need more than 3 this time. "Probably thought you'd still be with me," Crowley said, and Holt nodded thoughtfully. You realize that Morgorath can't afford to let you live now, don't you? He said. He'll probably trump up some charges against you. Say that you were responsible for the death of 2 of his loyal soldiers. That thought had occurred to me. Then come with me. We'll head for Gallica. There's always work for good fighting men there. And I can see you're a good fighting man. Holt indicated the bodies scattered across the road. But Crowley was already shaking his head before Holt finished speaking. I was thinking about what you said, about organising the remaining Rangers and fighting back. I've decided that's what I'm going to do. You're not worried about being declared a traitor? Holt asked. I'm going northeast to find Prince Duncan. As the heir to the throne, if he'll give me a royal warrant to assemble the other remaining Rangers and reform the corps, I can't be charged with treason. And he might find it useful to have a dozen or so highly trained men in his service. Holt considered Crowley's words for a few seconds, then nodded. That might be your best course, he said. And I like the idea of your reforming the Ranger Corps. Mind you, a dozen men isn't a lot. A dozen Rangers, Crowley corrected him. And it may not be a lot, but it's a start. He paused, then added, It'd be 13 if you'd consider joining us. I'm sure Prince Duncan could be persuaded to give you a commission in the corps. Holt shook his head, a frown bringing the dark eyebrows together. I don't place a great deal of trust in princes, he said. This one you can trust. He's a good man, Crowley told him. But still, the Hibernian was reluctant. They're all good men until they get a taste of power. Not this one. You can trust Duncan, believe me. A long, steady look passed between them. So you say, Holt said. Crowley nodded emphatically. Yes, I do. Do you trust me? Now Holt looked deep into Crowley's hazel eyes, and he saw nothing there but honesty and dedication. No sign of deceit or underhandedness. He recalled his earlier moment of unease, when he felt that, somehow, he was letting Crowley down by simply riding away. The sandy-haired ranger sensed that Holt was wavering. All our ancillary services are still in place. Our horse trainers and breeders and armourers, he said. They're just waiting for the chance to be reactivated. In a few years, we could build up a force to be reckoned with. I'd be happy to help you complete your training. Not that there's much you have to learn. You're already a far better shot than I am. Still, Holt said nothing, and a mischievous smile crept over Crowley's face as he played his final card. And wouldn't you like a chance to tweak Morgorath's skinny nose for him? He asked. In spite of himself, Holt smiled as well. A faint smile, it was true, but a smile nonetheless. From him, that was the equivalent of helpless mirth. Now that is an attractive offer, he said, and this time Crowley laughed out loud. Then you'll join us? You say this Duncan is a man to trust? I do. And a leader a man would be proud to follow? I certainly do. You have my word on that. There was a long pause. Crowley sensed he had said enough and waited for Holt to make his decision. Finally, the Hibernian nodded slowly. Then why not? I've never really been fond of Gallica. He held out his hand, and Crowley took it. They shook hands, each man noting the other's firm and positive grip. Each man sensing that this was the beginning of a long and remarkable partnership. Welcome to the corps, Crowley said.